One of my most vivid memories in Brampton was when I was in grade 1, sitting around the circle in the classroom, and my teacher was Miss Van Dinther. She was one of my most favorite teachers. To me, she had blonde hair and blue eyes, and she looked like a Barbie doll. And the reason why this was such a big memory for me was because when I was sitting around that circle, she asked us, and asked me directly, where my parents were from. And I remember sitting there very scared to answer that question. And here's the reason why. Because in the 1970s, my mother came to Canada. She was sponsored by our other family members, my aunts, my uncles, my grandmother, and eventually my dad. And both my parents were married here in Canada. We lived in the area of Jane and Finch, and very specifically on San Romano Way. That area was a melting pot of so much diversity and so many newcomers to the country. And I grew up with the support of my aunts and my uncles and everybody around me who were so diverse and from so many different countries. My cousins were my best friends. And so over the years, up until the age I was 5, my dad worked 2 jobs, my mother worked very hard, and by the time my baby sister was born, my parents had saved enough money to buy a house in Brampton. It was the immigrant's dream to own and purchase your own house. And that house was on Philosopher's Trail, and I could literally see Professor's Lake from my street. Beauverde was still a dirt road. And so when I was in senior kindergarten, uprooted from my area of Jane and Finch, away from my support network, and in senior kindergarten, I remember being made fun of. Being made fun of for the color of my skin, the slight slant in my eyes, and for, let's face it, being a little bit chubby. And so when Miss Van Dinther asked that question, by the time I got into grade 1, sitting around the circle, and asked me where my parents were from, I was very scared to answer the question. I didn't know what to say. And so you know what I said? I said I was from Quebec. It seemed foreign enough to me in grade 1. And it seemed safe enough that I wouldn't be made fun of. What's interesting was that by the time I got to grade 3, 4, 5, my whole family in that support network of my aunts and uncles and cousins ended up moving to Brampton and Peel region as well. My cousins were just down the road, 4 houses down on Philosopher's Trail. My mom's best friend moved in next door, and my neighbors to my right, Sam, Olive, and their daughter, Noella, and Brian, they were from Trinidad and Tobago. And there was this crazy diversity with all the new subdevelopment happening in Brampton. All these new people coming in. And then my dad continued to work 2 jobs. My mom continued to work hard, so that by the time we became teenagers, we were able to afford a bigger house. And we moved to the end section in Brampton. Beauverde was no longer a dirt road. It was paved. And they were just starting to talk about building Trinity Common Mall, which was just across the street from where my parents lived. When I went to a new school, grades 7 and 8, it was suddenly cool to look different. It was suddenly cool to be Filipino. And I remember going to high school, walking into that cafeteria and seeing so much multiculturalism in the cafeteria. I was hanging out with all the Filipinos, playing a Filipino card game, Posoy Dos. And just 2 months ago, I met up with a friend of mine from high school who reminded me, and he said to me, you know what? We were pretty cool hanging out all together. But he pointed out that despite that, there was still a level of divisiveness within our community. We who were born in Canada were born in Canada, Filipino-Canadian. But the newcomer Filipinos in high school, the ones with accents, were labeled as FOBs, fresh off the boat. And when my friend mentioned that to me, it brought me back, and it brought back some concern, because nowadays that just doesn't seem right. Now, when I went to university, I decided to go to the Schulich School of Business to do my business degree, and then I went to the London School of Economics to do my master's. And when I was at Schulich, in my 4th year university, I remember sitting in Professor Lipton's international business class, and he said to us, if you speak another language, you are at a competitive advantage. Suddenly, in this talk of globalization, you were at an advantage if you had an accent and could speak another language. And so then, I was having dinner, and I'm not sure if my dad remembers this. I was having dinner with my dad at their house, and I asked him, hey, Dad, why did you not teach me and my sisters Tagalog, which is the Filipino language? And he said to me, you know why? It's because when we first moved to Brampton, there was so much racism that we did not want you to grow up with an accent. We did not want you to be looked at differently or to be treated differently. And so we didn't teach you Tagalog. And in that moment, I remember being brought back to that carpet in Miss Van Dinther's class when she asked that question, where your parents are from, and being super scared to answer that question. Now, I have a son of my own, and his name is Lennon. He's here today, and his name is Lennon. He's named after John Lennon, and more specifically, the song Imagine. Now, Lennon is, from my side, Filipino and Spanish, and his dad is Slovak, French, and British. Lennon is this mishmash of different cultures and backgrounds and history, and it is a beautiful thing. What is more beautiful is that my parents, his Lola and Lolo, are now teaching him Tagalog and teaching him the language and teaching him the Filipino heritage and foods, and it's amazing to see. To a point where Lennon will have random conversations with Filipino strangers on the bus and at the CNE in the International Food Court. And there was one day in grade 1, just this past summer in grade 1, we were at the Brampton Farmers Market. And for those of you who have been there, there's a place in Garden Square, right next to Garden Square, there's a kiosk that sells all the various flags from different countries around the world. Lennon this summer ran up to the owners and said, I want to buy the Filipino flag. Please let me buy the Filipino flag. Unfortunately, they didn't have the Filipino flag in stock. And Lennon demanded every single weekend to go back there to get the Filipino flag. After 3 weeks, it finally arrived. And on that day, my son took that flag for $6 and started parading up and down the street of downtown Brampton in the farmers market. Now imagine that. It took an entire generation. When I was in grade 1, I was asked about how different I was and why I was different and where my parents came from. And now I have a son of my own who was parading up and down on his own accord the Filipino flag. And every single time I walk into his classroom or I go to his school, I could literally see the world in front of my eyes. It is such a beautiful thing. Our city has come such a long way in just one generation. Now, can you imagine what it would be like if we provided the supports, the leadership, and the role models for our kids so that they can continue not just celebrating the diversity and celebrating our differences, but let's take it up another notch. Let's get our children to instead also discuss and talk and engage about the many, many ways that we are in fact similar, because we are. And if we continue as leaders to engage them in that conversation of celebration of our differences and talk about all the ways that we are similar, Imagine what contribution the next generation is going to make for the city of Brampton and also for our community. Thank you so much for sharing my story.